Welcome to Impact Farming, where we introduce you to the people and ideas that will have a massive impact on your farming operation. Brought to you by Farm Marketer. Sit down, start the engine, and let's roll with today's show.
Hello, everyone. Tracy here. Welcome back to another episode. I am so thankful to have you joining me for another fantastic conversation. But before we dive right in, a quick word from this week's sponsor.
The season's just about to get underway. What have you been up to?
I'm not sitting around. Off-season's busy. Got a couple rookies to train up, some new systems to learn. But we'll be ready.
And what canola are you growing this year?
We chose BY7204LL, Brett Young's new Liberty Link canola hybrid. Our neighbor grew 7204 last year, said it's high yielding, it's got good standability, pod shatter tolerance, and strong defense against club root. It's a game changer.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today, I have an amazing guest joining me, Mike Downey. How are you?
Doing well, Tracy. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to have you on the show. Mike is a farm succession expert. I've been following him on LinkedIn for quite some time. He has amazing content and he does great work with farmers. So I'm doing a bigger focus back into transition planning. So I'm really pumped about this interview. So Mike, welcome. Let's have fun. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Let's do it.
Good. Let's do it. So before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this good old farm girl expression, can you tell our audience more about your background, the work you do, and your companies that you own?
You bet. No, happy to. I'm born and raised family farm actually in West Central Illinois and here in the Midwest. And I can still remember very vividly back in the late 90s. I was getting my ag degree and the price of corn was about $1.90 a bushel, which I'm sure most of your listeners can relate to that and what that perspective is to today. But nonetheless, I didn't have a strong opportunity to return to my family farm. It was already supporting two families. That led me to the professional just the ag industry in general. Started off in the farm management field, but discovered succession planning actually back in 2012 when we had our last significant tax sunset, which was going to occur. And that motivated a lot of people to do some estate planning, including my parents. And that's when I first met an individual that has a consulting company based out of Iowa that works specifically with family farms. And long story short, I joined him, and then along the way, created a company called Next Gen Ag Advocates, which is actually founded by two farmers. The unique story about Next Gen, it has a matching and mentoring program, kind of based more focused on non-family transitions,
Wow.
connecting retiring farmers with maybe an interested producer or a young couple to take over. And along the way, started a foundation to help beginning and young farmers called Start a Farmer Foundation for folks looking to help the next generation. And then more recently, I've joined an organization called Uncommon Farms, who was looking for somebody with some succession planning experience to support their members. They consult with about 100 farm operations across North America, including Canada, just on more higher level holistic consulting of all phases of the operation. And I serve as one of their coaches as well, specifically working with members. So I guess at the end of the day, family farm is my passion, and part of a small family farm, kind of things have kind of come full circle with my wife and I, who own and operate 250 acres and work back and forth with her family operation that she was raised on.
Nice. Wow. So you have a foot in the door in a few places. That's why you have such great posts all the time. When I open LinkedIn, I don't know if it suggests you to me, but there's your post. I'm like, oh, good. Got to read this one. You have some good information. So I'm excited to have you here on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I'm not a huge social media person, but I Several years back, I chose one and just focused on that, and that was LinkedIn. And yeah, it's been neat. I've made a lot of great connections out there, including yourself. So.
Excellent. And I just found you on Twitter too. I'm not sure if you're active on there anymore, but I just found you on there.
Not real active occasionally, but
Okay.
I've just it's enough to be active on one for me. I just can't. I don't have the capacity to do more than one. So
I tell you, it's a lot. Okay, so I am really excited about this conversation because I personally think succession planning is super important. I've seen what has happened when there's lack of succession planning. Personally, in my family and the community, you just hear it. You can't talk to any farmer and ask the question, do you know of a family that fought and divided because of succession planning? Probably everybody in the room would put up their hand, wouldn't they? I mean, it's just so common. It's heartbreaking. So leading into the first question, I wanted to ask you, I heard you mention the great farm wealth transfer. It's looming ahead. Can you expand on that? Because I think that will really set a stage for how important this conversation is.
sure. Well, I don't think it's any secret, probably to your listeners, that the age of farmland owners are the oldest in history when you just look at the demographics and the amount of wealth and land that's estimated to transfer hands over the next 10 or 15 years is estimated to be a record high, a record amount ever in history. So, and compound the fact that the land values have inflated and done what they have, equipment values, just farm assets in general. And with the demographic that owns that and everything, it's just inevitable. It's just a matter of time when we start seeing these transfers occur, and we're starting to see them now. And so certainly we think it's more than ever important to have a good plan in place to not only pass the assets to complement the plan, but also preserve and protect the wealth that folks have generated and built over their farming careers.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, so I normally ask this question different, and I'm choosing to break it out. I normally would ask this, what stops farmers from planning? But I'm going to purposely separate it, and you can deal with them both at once, but I want to separate them. What external barriers prevent farmers from planning? And then what internal things prevent them? So the people side and then all those other things. Can you touch on that? Just share your
Sure.
thoughts. What do you see as the excuses and reasons from farmers?
Well, certainly the external factors, with another tax sunset looming ahead, with the 2025 here in the States, the state tax exemptions are due to sunset unless they're voted to extend. But certainly, tax factors like that, or just the capital required in general to run a farm operation, or for the next generation to get involved, and all these factors that kind of combine together is certainly one factor, I guess you would, from the external side. The internal, I guess, more of the emotional side, or the soft side, if you will. That's an interesting phenomenon that it's been difficult for me even to describe, Tracy, because this occupation of farming is just it's a different animal. A lot of folks, this is their identity. This is all they know.
Yeah.
It's just a way of life, great way to raise a family. And so for that reason, it's difficult for a lot of folks to really talk about it and even get started. And it's just, again, it's a kind of a interesting dilemma where I don't know that I've met one farmer who hasn't communicated to me that they want to pass the farm down to the next generation, but it's such a difficult subject for them to even talk about.
Yeah, isn't it? So external factors, internal. Do you think confusion and not knowing where to even start is What would you say, touch on that, because I forgot to ask you about that. And what do you say is the biggest reason? Is it just human nature or just confusion or time? Why don't people do what we need to do?
Yeah, and I would say there's a certain amount that I do talk to that are ready to do some planning. They just don't know where to even start, who to go to. We talk about needing to find a lot more young farmers, but that's the same issue out in the practitioner world. The attorneys and accountants and professionals, the advisors, that as they go to retire, there's not many there to have, to fill their shoes, their own successors out in rural areas. So that even where to go to talk to an expert that specializes in this farm estate planning and transition planning is a challenge in of itself. But yeah, I think that's certainly one. But again, the other thing is the emotional part with family and the whole fair versus equal and how to do this to treat everybody fairly. And that's a whole nother conversation in itself that we have to work through with each one.
I believe it. That human nature part is just hard to overcome too. And I'm a little bit ashamed, but I'll be honest. I had started this show and I'm talking about the importance of wills, and our will actually wasn't fully done. And I found myself sitting on it. It's not hard at all. And it's not super expensive, but I'm sitting on it. I'm like, what is this? And it was an interesting learning experience for me, talking to guests and actually feeling some of that resistance, whatever that reason was. I'm like, I think this is some of the succession planning resistance that farmers face, eh?
Yeah, it's definitely something they might start off as a priority as we roll over the new year, as we talk about new year goals. But then when people get busy, human nature is just an easy thing to kind of fall down the list and to I guess human nature, just procrastinate, and we'll work on that later.
Yeah. And some of it's hard. And like you said, you don't want to talk about it. Who wants to talk about death either? It's like, yeah, let's just hit the combine now. We don't need to deal with this. Okay, so I want to ask one or two more questions, kind of high level, set the stage, get your thoughts on what you're seeing. And then I want to dig in. And I'm sure you're not going to love this, because I know as an advisor, you're like, there's a million different situations, Tracy. One of my frustrations trying to communicate this and have the most powerful episodes, I want to be like, okay, here, audience, here's a cookie cutter plan. I just find so many farmers just don't even know like the right things to think about or to start. So I'm going to ask you one or two more questions and I'm going to say, okay, here's a scenario. Mike, can you give some options? Are you okay with that? If we
You bet.
roll? Okay. So let's ask this one first. What are some of the biggest mistakes tactic wise? We talked about external barriers, internal. Let's talk about tactics. Like farmers are like, okay, I'm going to do it. And then they just do this. Do you see some big mistakes that farmers make that we want to point out before we get going?
A couple come to mind. I mean, as a general rule, one thing I see at the tax and legal community in general would promote or have a lot of farmers wait and pass everything through their estate,
Okay.
because our tax laws, quite frankly, incentivize us to do that because of things like a step up in basis of assets and things.
Okay.
But one thing I've learned in family farm planning, that waiting till death is not always the best plan.
Mm,
Putting some things in motion with some continuity, certainty, allowing the next generation to start getting some skin and equity in the game,
yeah.
versus trying to always wait till the end. And the next generation may be in their 50s or 60s by that time, and they're just now getting started into the ownership roles. That's one observation I've made. I guess just trying to think. I had another thought that I just lost, Tracy. So you're gonna have to interject while I think
Yeah.
of it.
A question I have, and I've heard people talk about this. Who is the right person to see? And I'm going to bring in a thought and ask you this question and slap me on the hand if it's not correct. But let's say I'm Farmer Joe or Farmer Tracy. Okay. I'm in my older years and I have a kid that's coming back to the farm. I want to do transition planning. Do I go straight to my lawyer? Do I go straight to my accountant? I've heard the concept that sometimes, unless you find the right individual, like a coach or somebody that consults, if you go straight to the wrong accountant, maybe, and I'm going to get beat up for this. If you go to the accountant, they're concerned about the numbers. If you go to the lawyer, they're concerned about the legal. If you go, is it important to find that right person that can just look at it all and they get all the different tactics and concerns and can look at the whole family? Because I've heard that's a concern. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I think what you're hitting on, resonates with me, is I think there's a real need to have, I've heard it called different things, from a facilitator to a quarterback,
Yeah.
someone just to keep everybody accountable and work with all those different players, because a lot of those individual players aren't necessarily the best at playing that role,
Yeah.
helping folks kind of understand all the options, and then bring the advisors in, bring the family in, and really facilitate that process, whether it's a consultant, a facilitator, a coach, whatever that may be. And I did think about my other thought earlier, and
Okay. Yeah.
the other thing is just the financial part of it, I think, is a huge area that is getting overlooked right now with inflated values and everything. But as every family farm passes, you think how every family farm either gets divided or buyouts occur between family. But I was just working with one yesterday that the general sentiment from the elder generation was, well, our son should be fine. We're giving him a 30% discount with his half of the equity. He'll be fine. But when we actually play that out with actual numbers and today's interest rates and things, it's a little eye-opening for folks. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of estate plans out there awaiting these buyouts that maybe are not going to just be financially feasible and cash flow, and it's going to put a lot of stress on family farms.
Ooh, I love that. When I was getting ready for this interview with you, I went through all your articles, trying to think of the best questions to ask you to pull that wisdom out. And I landed on the article where you covered that. And that was actually probably one of my favorite, where you're going, okay, if they buy it at market value, it's this. That doesn't cash flow. If they get the discount, that doesn't cash flow. Here's an option, right? And that was a powerful article. I appreciated that one.
Yeah, and it leads to a discussion, and it's interesting. Even between, I've been sat across the table from a husband and wife, spouse before, where they've even been maybe at different odds, or the spectrum of that is, are we more concerned about the perceived inheritance of how are we set up these family buyouts and valuations, or are we more concerned about those that are going to try to keep this together and what financial position they'll be? But that's certainly a big dilemma in finding that right spot for each family.
And that, you hit the nail on the head. And I was thinking about this. I think transition planning in the very beginning, and just the way it is, there's so many competing parties competing, and that's the wrong word, but you have the founders with their goals and needs. You have the farm that might need this at this to continue on. And then you have the off-farm children that are like, well, hey, wait, what about me? Right? So there's so many maybe opposing agendas. Just by the very nature of that, it can be hard to plan, wouldn't it? Because you're trying to make everybody happy and there's different goals here.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, usually something has to give. We're not going to get it all, so what's really identifying the highest priority, what's most important, and really understanding that, working with folks to really establish a value that they feel is fair for their family, a family market value, not necessarily a fair market value, which is based off external factors that you asked about before, what, other non-farmers are willing to purchase land for, which can impact the appraisal values and so forth, which aren't always the right process to use for our own family farm, for our own process.
Right. Wow. Okay, so I'm curious, in your role, who's the person that comes to you most often? I have a sneaking feeling I know the answer. Is it the founder or Gen 2? Who's coming to say, hey, Mike, I need help?
Yeah, I've definitely seen everything, but my favorite story is that I like to tell, and I'll skip ahead to the answer, is Gen 2, but this
Yeah.
is one of my first calls I received was from a 70-year-old farmer. So you would initially think that's Gen 1, but we booked that call, that appointment, and walking in with him was his father, 93 years old, who he was still farming with. And I quickly realized we weren't there to talk about succession planning for the 70-year-old, but for his dad. And by the end of that process, quite frankly, we were talking about a transition to the third generation who were in their 30s and 40s, because the 70-year-old in the middle was just like, at this point, we might as well talk about a transition to my kids.
Wow. That's hitting the emotions on my end for various reasons because, wow, yeah, this is just such a hard thing. Like, kudos to you guys that work with the farmers because I have so many thoughts and feelings about that, right? It's like that poor 70-year-old, maybe he missed his chance because I'm judging, Mike. Bear with me, I'm judging. 90-year-old didn't let go of the reins. 70-year-old missed his chance. And then now the 30 and 40 years old, that's prime to be taking ownership. So good for them. But maybe I'll summarize my feeling session here with that's why this work is so important, right?
Yeah, and it's another factor how there's people are living longer and able to continue to participate in the farm longer.
Yeah.
That's why I really think we need to remove the R word out of our vocabulary of retirement. To me, it's more of a transition. Where can we transition that elder generation to allow them to still be involved?
Okay, I love it. Okay, I'll put my feelings aside.
Okay.
I threw them over there, okay? Oh, geez. So why don't we go into a situation? Because I just want to provide more than anything food for thought for people in the audience. Like, oh, there is options. Because I remember even being young and Anthony coming back to the farm and going, what does this look like? And not everybody, you might be well researched and know some options, but most people are like, okay, I want to take over the farm. But then you get those competing priorities. So as much as we can, I'll give you a scenario that's pretty broad and common. And if you can just say, this is how we could handle, just to give some ideas to somebody in the audience where they could go, oh, okay, if there's off-farm kids, we can do this. Encouragement and knowledge, right? For them to take the next step and connect with somebody. So let's take a very common one. Farm kid is the farm kid out of 3, let's say. Okay, he was always interested, he, she, doesn't matter, was always interested in the farm. The other 2, not a hot interest. Farm kid goes to university, he, she comes back, and he wants to take over the farm one day. It's pretty clear. Everybody kind of figures out what happened. The parents are open, don't have a hot clue what to do because who has time to figure that out? And then there's the off-farm kids to try and take care of and fair and equal. So I'm the farm kid. I probably will get the ball rolling. I phone you up and say, hey, Mike, this is our family situation. So how would you answer me? How do we deal with, and I made a few notes of things I'll throw quick and you just talk after that and tell me how you'd handle this. But enough income to support the farm kid. I think that's most important. Or off farm. How do we handle off farm siblings, fair versus equal? Income to the retiring generation, because I think a lot of times the young generation doesn't realize that. If I take this farm over and I get this income, where's mom and dad get income from? I didn't fully understand that when I was young either. Management transition to ownership. Should that all happen at once? what's the most cost effective way to buy the farm? Do I just say, here, parents, here's all this money? So do you want to riff on that? I just rung you up and I said, Mike, here's our situation. Can you help?
Sure, sure. No, that there's definitely a lot there. I mean,
Yeah, sorry, loaded question.
one thing that I have found helpful is, maybe mom and dad think of the farm and everything kind of all together, one and the same, because that's how they've operated their farming career. Well, in the example that you described, it's sometimes helpful for me to start having folks think about the day-to-day operations over here in one pot,
Okay.
and maybe the longer term assets like the ownership in farmland, the assets in a different pot, because those could transition to different folks. The farming heir is, I would argue, more likely a better transition of the day-to-day assets, who he or she will need to rely on to continue the operation, whereas the long-term assets, could be shared ownership amongst all the family. And the long-term assets are also for the elder generation. To a certain extent, that's where their equity is, their retirement that they've generated their farming career. So by delineating those two, we can also set up a better flow of income through whatever the farm may be paying to rent those acres for mom and dad to support them. And so that's, one thing I found as a step one is let's start thinking about this in kind of different segments of the operation.
Clever. I would have not actually thought about that. And you're right. When you just separate that you start to think about it different, right? Versus here's farm, here's operations, here's assets.
Yeah. And then from there, as far as your questions on the income needs to support the next generation, unfortunately, that's another trend out there that it's a challenge for many. More and more operations are relying on off-farm or other supplemental income to support the operation. Unfortunately, that's the reality that I think we live in. We're probably going to continue to see more. Diversification has been a buzzword I've noticed from a lot of the conversations I have with family farms looking for other diverse sources of income just to diversify. And so that's definitely part of the conversation. As far as how to best buy the farm, that might depend on what the long-term goals are. If one of them is to pass the long-term assets like land to all the kids, maybe that removes the pressure off having to buy the farm. If their mindset is, hey, those who are continuing the farm, we feel should also have ownership of the land, that's just their school of thought, then that would obviously open the conversation. Well, how do we do that? How do we set this up? Whether that's a buyout through the estate plan or more proactive buyout, like selling, buying it on a contract. Those are just kind of the different things we start brainstorming and seeing which ones stick to the wall, which ones don't, as we kind of narrow down what might be the right fit for their situation.
Interesting. We accidentally, I guess, right and wrong, probably in the way that we started. Anthony started farming. We bought our first, I think, 18 cows back in whatever year. So then we farmed with Anthony's parents. So those 18 cows slid in. And then I was making a good income. So then we got to the point where you missed, and I forget when he quit his full-time job, but we got to the point where we lost a calf. And I'm like, calf price is $1,000. What are you making at your job? It doesn't take many of those decisions. And then the timing to be right, where then he quit and then we grew our herd. And then finally we're buying some of the land, whether the details on that, but it's interesting to think of the different ways, right? Sometimes if we don't know this work, which a lot of us don't, you go, okay, I need to buy the farm. And that's like, what, then it doesn't make sense, but I like how you separate it.
Yeah, thank you. And then there's also, just working through different misconceptions over the different options available. I mean, I work with some folks that truly believe they can't sell the farm to the kids because
Oh,
of some perceived capital gain tax, or even gifting the farm. We can't do that because of some gift tax. Just a lot of misconceptions we have to work through as well to kind of debunk, to make sure that they actually understand the options available to them.
interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that answered a lot of my questions. Is there any other food for thought when somebody, let's say I'm calling you up, what else would you be telling me? What would you be coaching me on? How do we get the conversation going?
Mhm. Yeah, so great question. Sometimes, like we said earlier, the hardest part for some is just where to even start.
Yeah.
We talked about, thinking about the different buckets that might transition to different parties, but to boot, maybe even backing up a step from that, is I always like to kind of understand where it is we're heading, with the end in mind, because
Right.
oftentimes people come in asking questions about LLCs or trusts or this and that. But, well, first help me understand what is your long-term goal, because then we can back up and talk about those different tools you might consider to put in place. Um, but sometimes they even need help to understand that, and kind of walking through. Well, I wrote a piece on the 5 Ws of farmland succession to help folks with that: the who, what, where, why. Just to think through of your own family farm, and who are the players
Yeah.
in the family, whether it's the ownership or management leadership roles, who they are, what are the assets we're talking about. That kind of goes back to what assets should be best applicable to go to certain parties of the family, where and when we're going to transfer them. And the most important part for me is the why, and identifying the why. And I'm a big proponent of having family meetings. Let's have a meeting about it now, almost like a reading of the will. And the folks that decide to do that, I've seen dramatically decrease the chances of problems or disputes in the family later.
Well, isn't it, I think Elaine phrased this is her expression, clarity is kindness. Isn't that true? Like, just let's talk about it. And I guess that's personalities and comfort level and all the soft skills, but wouldn't being clear and upfront just make everything better?
Yeah, I would. It's interesting. Sometimes there's a pin up anxiety or concern over this meeting with the kids, but more times than not, the kids just really appreciate knowing and are supportive of whatever mom and dad do, and just removes the pressure of any surprises later. And a lot of times, even I've seen it actually generate more family unity by actually having that meeting with the kids about it.
Yeah. This topic is super important to me because for various reasons. Myself as a person, I'm big on being in control of my destiny, right? That's just how I am. I don't like going with the flow on somebody else's agenda. Fair enough, we need to, but we made very different decisions on how to build our operation. So we had control because sometimes I think it's unkind to leave people hanging and you don't know your financial destiny, right? When you go to a job, you know your position, you know this. But if you're coming back to the farm and nobody wants to have that conversation, that's a yucky vibe, isn't it? Like there's just that unspoken vibe, whatever we want to call it, right?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, again, that kind of goes back. It's just so different, the whole farming occupation, way of life versus what someone might be used to on day to day W-2. That's a little easier to retire from, and that's why I think it's important to recognize that in the world of succession planning with farm families.
I also like how you said that it can bring more family harmony, because I've seen it where this is the unspoken tension current in the family, and it starts to divide quickly because they're wondering what's going on. This farm kid's wondering if they're taking over, and there's just that unspoken current there. And it already starts to cause tension and disagreements because it's not addressed. And then when one of the founders pass away, then all hell breaks loose, right? Because that
Yeah.
tension's been there for so long.
Yeah, and sometimes when mom or dad aren't there, things can change with certain family members, and it just takes one to start asking questions or making things a little difficult, and others might follow, and then all of a sudden you've got a whirlwind mass storm that is hard to undo and or unwind. So
Yeah. And really, at the end of the day, if we can overcome, I think an awareness piece is important. And generations, we're changing, right? My grandfather didn't really know what succession planning was. He didn't have podcasts, maybe an article here and there in the local newspaper, but he didn't have all the information that we do now. So let's hope we're changing and doing a better job. But I think really the first starting point, correct me if I'm wrong, is, hi, Mike, I'm the farm founder or farm daughter. This is what's going on. Can you help? Right. And then you would just say, okay, what's what? And then you look at it as a consultant, expert, and then you have that 30,000-foot view and you go, okay, well, I've done 300, 400 of these, and here's some options, right? And it's not that you're coming in to tell them exactly what to do. You're just saying, here's some options, right?
right, yeah, and the fact that I'm not an attorney or a CPA, just a consultant role, just to provide the information, and and have worked with other family farms and seen those. I think there's some value in people in that, because sometimes certain firms might have certain things that they recommend for folks, or
Right.
I've talked to folks that have gone to talk and gotten 3 different legal opinions, and they've gotten 3 different, they've been different enough that just creates more doubt, what's the right thing to do. We're hearing different things, getting different recommendations, so that certainly plays into it as well.
I like that. And I kind of think when you were talking about this earlier, like facilitating the people, knowing the different aspects that need to be handled, literally the coach term is perfect. I'm not a big sports person. I love sports, but I don't follow it every day. But like the farm coach, farm transition coach is literally like the coach. You're there, you know the players and the different strategies, and you know the end goal, and then you help make that happen, right?
Right. And that's what, you know, uh, led me to the opportunity with Uncommon Farms as a coaching role. It just really intrigues me. I'm seeing a trend of more family farms, businesses wanting to really work with an outside advisor, consultant, even collaborate with other farm families, having peer groups, and really working on the business, the succession, but also the financial, all aspects of it, the management, leadership, strategic planning, and so forth. And so that, to me, is something I think you're going to continue to see a trend in the future of farms as they become more progressive and, wanting to work more and collaborate with others.
Okay. I have a question for you too. As we're talking, I think of more and more things. So, and again, here's the I want a cookie cutter answer, Mike. Okay.
Okay.
No. What is reasonable? What's a good plan? Okay, Tracy comes back from university. I took agriculture diploma. I'm coming back to the farm to farm. I was always the kid interested in farming. It's clear I'm going to be the one to come back. So I come back, talk to the parents. We assume there's enough income. They're going to pay me. So I'm coming back to the farm. When here's the cookie cutter. When should we start talking about this? Because to me, I think that's an uncomfortable dynamic, and I'm going to share my thoughts. There's so much to all these conversations. I'm young. I'm coming back. I want to take over the world, take over the farm. I'm eager. I don't have the experience. I need to farm and manage financials and get some bumps in life. Maybe call it that, right? Like I did. Um, when's the right time to be talking about this? How soon should it be talked about before I even come back to the farm? X many years. And then on the flip side, how long is too long? Because I see where these conversations don't happen and the farm kid sticks around. I mean, if they're gaining an income and that's all good, good. But if there's so much tension, like how quick is too quick and how long is too long?
Yeah, I mean, my cookie cutter response would be you never get too started too soon. But
Yeah.
my 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 legitimate answer to that, I guess, is when you look at a lot of these family farms and there's multiple generations, sometimes 3 or 4 generations involved. If we can, and there's actually charts out there that illustrate this, but if we can have each generation having a role in the operation at the same time, as one generation is transitioning out, the next one has started the transition to overtake their management and leadership roles. The generation behind them is starting to get started to do the same. That's when we can really have a truly efficient family farm business, when all generations are at different spots, but they're all recognize what their roles are and responsibilities and everything. Because if we wait, that goes back to my example of the 70-year-old before, that by the time they're ready to take over the management and leadership, they're 70 years old. And the next generation behind them, like you said, is they're eager and willing and probably able to take on some of those roles themselves. So
It's such a hard question. I look at myself too as a business owner and us farming. And even I wouldn't have agreed with this when years ago, right? Because you're young and you know everything and you're going to take over the world in essence, right? That's the beauty of youth. You have the confidence. But being on a farm and managing it and going through the cycles and figuring out cash flow, if you're just, here's a farm, that could be a financial disaster because you need some bumps along the road, right? To go, oh, okay, like, you know what I mean? To really actually physically, university teaches you financials. Business teaches you business and income in and out. And those are two different things. So to me, it's trying to find that sweet spot. And then, right, like you said, maybe bringing in all those generations.
yeah, sometimes easier said than done, obviously. But
Yeah.
I would say, as a general rule, most farms I work with like to see some sort of a vesting period, if you will, where
Yeah.
you're not going to just get automatic ownership just because you come back. There's going to be a period where you work with the farm and prove yourself, make sure you have the same, sharing
Yeah.
the same values for the family and the business. And then at some point you talk about, well, how do we get more involvement or skin in the game through equity or buy-ins, transfers, whatever that may look like, or having the ability to use some of the family resources like equipment to go try to start your own little operation, but working together as a family. So
I like that. I like to think I'm in that sweet spot in age where I'm no longer that young person and I get how they think and it's still pretty fresh. And I can also appreciate the position that the founding generation's in. Like, I've worked hard on this. Like, I don't want to be kicked off the farm. This is my identity. I'm finally paying stuff off. I feel good. So it's just a mix of emotions, isn't it?
oh, absolutely, yep, for sure. So
Okay, I have two questions. Do you want to add anything on that process and consulting with family? I think we went pretty in depth. If you want to add anything, go ahead. The next thing I want to ask, Oh, go ahead.
There's all kinds of different tangents we can go, but
Yeah.
probably not going to cover it all in one segment like this. But
Yeah. I'll book you for about 5 more episodes. Okay.
there you go.
Literally, you need, because each one of those things could be a whole episode, right?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, I know. I love, and you're sharing some good options here, because I find a lot of those young people, they're just spinning. How do we start the conversation? Who do we talk to? What do we do? Where do we go? And then the founders are probably still doing the same thing. Oh my gosh, I know I got to do this. Billy Joe or Susie Q is going to get mad and leave the farm, and I want them to stay. So it's just a interesting process. I think I'd sum it up that way. You would know better than I would.
And no two are exactly the same. So.
Oh, the patience you must have. So I want you to touch really quick. You have a company, or you're involved in a company that matches farmers with like a third party. Is that correct? And then you do some of that work?
A lot of family transition, but there's also a lot of transition occurring between non-family. There's a high percentage of retiring farmers that are estimated they don't actually have active farming heirs, but going back to delineating the land from the operations that help support even not, what if we find a non-family person to transition and carry forward our operations that will work with our family who may be off the farm, that will be involved over here with the ownership of the long-term assets.
Interesting. And so I don't think these ideas farmers would traditionally think of. I wouldn't.
Yeah, and I think it's more and more thinking about that. And for the young and beginning farmers, that's an opportunity for them, to have some of those conversations with the retiring farmers in their neighborhoods that maybe not have a successor. When I usually ask a young person, think about the farmers in your neighborhood that don't have kids who farm with them, and it doesn't take them long to think of 2 or 3 or 4 in a hurry. So those are all opportunities. The whole goal is that we hopefully can keep those farms in our community.
Yeah.
For a young couple to continue forward, that will support the community, the local businesses and schools, because the big concern is every time a farm leaves our community, whether it's sold to someone outside the community or somebody's coming from a long distance away to farm that, every time that happens, that's probably a farm we're not going to see come back to support our community again.
Interesting. And you know what? Changing dynamics in the world in general, but for farming, I look at my grandparents, 11 children. I look at Anthony's parents, 2 children. I look at us, no children. So I believe it. Now what happens? We've built up a pretty nice operation. If there's no kids there, does it all just get sold off, or do you find a local kid that wants to farm?
Yeah, that shares in our same passion and goals and philosophies and so forth. And a certain segment of retiring farmers would just would help a young couple get started, versus having that farm sale where they might give a hefty chunk of that to Uncle Sam in the form of taxes from liquidation. So
yeah, sure enough. Interesting. Changing dynamics. Okay, this is great. Is there anywhere else that you would like to go? Anywhere else? Anything, other thoughts, words of wisdom for our audience?
Sure. Well, yeah, the cliche is there's never a time to get started sooner than now. But, certainly I do think we have more at risk than we have, just with the amount of wealth that's going to transfer, just demographics, all these things. There's a lot of, perfect storm of events, if you will, that could line up that could potentially derail the successful transfer of family farms. And that's what keeps me up at night. So just trying to help folks understand what those options are, get the conversation started. And I thank you for your efforts to help bring more awareness to this.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for those kind words. I know it's a tough place to be in as a young farmer and a founder. And I've felt these things. I've seen farm families break up because of this. So I think it's important in these conversations. One last question I'll ask you. If there's a farmer in the audience, of course, Canada to the US is different in legal and that kind of stuff. But my encouragement would be if somebody is on the farm and the founders aren't bringing it up, I'm going to say something unpopular, but they're probably quite comfortable with everything the way it is. And there's no real need for them to plan, and they might not know where to start and have those conversations. Would the onus, to me, and I don't think a lot of people know this, find a person like you, pick up the phone and say, here's where we are at. Because sometimes I think we're waiting on our parents, because they're our parents, right? They know everything. They're the smart adults. We're waiting on them when they might not be the person to gather the knowledge and maybe say, hey, here's some options we've learned. Is that what you would encourage young farmers to do?
Yeah, I think really just finding that good information, and if they start sitting down and searching around, they might be able to find it, easier than they believe. If they just sit down and do that, there's a lot of great resources out there, from universities to podcasts to ag publications. I do some writing for Farm Futures. I do a blog for them. Workshops, farm transition workshops, just a lot of information if you start looking around that you can find. So
excellent. Mike, you're amazing. I love this. I was so excited for this conversation. I knew there was going to be a ton of value in here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Always happy to share.
You are so welcome. If somebody in the audience wants to follow you, connect with you, how can they do so?
Yeah, well, you already mentioned at the beginning, I am out there on LinkedIn, just Michael Downey, and I do a blog for Farm Futures called More Than Dirt.
Okay.
There's some good information out there. Otherwise, the two companies that we've mentioned before, we have a lot of resources on our websites as well, nextgenag.us and then uncommonfarms.com.
Okay, excellent. I'll make a note to put these notes in the show notes. That's a lot of notes, but they'll be there for you. If you want to check it out, go to Farm Marketer, Impact Farming Show, find the episode, scroll to the bottom, and all these links will be here for you. Mike, thank you. This was an amazing conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you again, Tracy. I appreciate it. Enjoyed
You're
it.
very, very, very welcome. You in the audience, thanks for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, a lot of great food for thought in there. Like it, share it, get it out there, because every farmer needs to hear the great stuff Mike just shared. Thanks, guys. See you next week.
You've been listening to Impact Farming. For more great episodes and articles designed to help you manage and grow your farming operation, head on over to farmmarketer.com. Don't forget to sign up while you're there. We will see you on the next episode.